Any questions? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Practical Inclusion on a Friday afternoon. Myself and my guests are both wearing Friday afternoon shirts, I think is the best way to describe it. It's certainly a different time frame for me and for this session, but I think there's quite a few showing interest, so hopefully we get a few of you on live today. If you are on live on Facebook or LinkedIn, please put comments, questions as we go along. We really welcome them. I'd obviously like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I broadcast from today, which is the land of the Wadawurrung people down in Geelong, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who watch us live on either of those platforms or also who catch the replay later on. My guest today, Alastair Lawrie, whose lands are you broadcasting in from today?
So I'm joining you from the land of the Dharawal people in Wollongong, and I too pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Beautiful, thank you. We are, as I said in one of these previously, we really are getting around the country and learning all the different lands that people are doing this inclusion work from, which is also a kind of cool, exciting part of this process. So, Alastair, as usual, I like to get my guests to introduce themselves because I'm a bit lazy in that respect. But I also really appreciate the guests who are coming on the show who really are sharing their stories with us and with the audience. So I'm wondering if we can do the same thing with you. I came across you on Twitter, and if you're not following Alastair on Twitter, do so. His content is incredibly useful, engaging, and regular. So do that. But I won't steal your thunder. Tell us a bit about your story, and particularly why advocacy in this public policy space, which is where you seem to play.
Sure, thanks very much. So I grew up in Queensland, in central Queensland, on a cattle property in the 1980s, and then attended a religious boarding school in Brisbane in the early 1990s. And that was a horrific and horrifically homophobic experience and had a significant influence on my life, and probably not the one that the school would have wanted. So I think I can trace my interest and passion for LGBTI rights, and in particular for LGBTI anti-discrimination reform to that time. But it's really something that I have engaged in consistently over the last couple of decades. So professionally, I've been in the Victorian Public Service, a Commonwealth Ministerial Advisor from 2008 to 2012, and more recently in the New South Wales community sector, so for Hepatitis New South Wales, and currently now for the Public Interest Advocacy Centre. But it's really outside of work that I do a lot of my LGBTI advocacy. So I've been the policy working group chair of both the Victorian and New South Wales gay and lesbian rights lobbies. I've been involved in a range of other organisations, including currently being a mentor for the Pinnacle Foundation, which is a fantastic organisation. And I write a lot about LGBTI rights and anti-discrimination law reform at www.alastairlawrie.net. And as you said, on Twitter, a Lawrie to Jesus. And sometimes people ask me about the to Jesus part. That's because my partner is of Portuguese background. So the hyphen is there.
Fantastic. Thanks for telling us that. It's always, I find, quite a mix of feelings when you hear somebody's bad experience being LGBTI, and that then creating some incredibly amazing advocates in this space. And it's this awful kind of, you wish that you had never had that. I wish that you had never had that experience, but the rest of the LGBTI community is benefiting from that, from the work that you're doing. And I think we should always call that out, that, there's a lot of people working in this space who are doing it, and they come from a place where, that wasn't a positive experience for them, and really working so hard to make other people's lives, a better and greater experience going forward. So definitely.
And that's a lot that I try to focus on, that I might have had a horrible experience, but we need to make sure that the next generation and the generation after that don't.
Yeah, exactly. It feels a bit like a responsibility at times, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
But it's not, you're doing this work for free, and it's incredibly valuable and important. So let's get into some of the meaty questions, because I think this topic is quite meaty, some of the stuff that you do. And one of the things that we spoke about when we first connected was around the very topical issue of the religious discrimination bills that are kind of floating around the country currently. I'm interested to kind of dive into this. But maybe firstly, can you paint the picture a little? Because we certainly heard a lot of stuff in the media around the religious discrimination bill pre-COVID, kind of just before that potentially. And perhaps it's gone off the radar for a lot of us. So what's the current state of play in terms of the Commonwealth bill? And I know there's a New South Wales bill as well on the table, I believe.
Sure. So the Commonwealth Government has already released 2 exposure draft religious discrimination bills for comment. One was in the second half of last year, and then one was over the summer period. That closed for comment at the end of January. And in fact, the Commonwealth Government was preparing to introduce its bill to Commonwealth Parliament in March. Obviously, some other world events intervened at that point, but they have not said that they will not proceed with that. So it's possible they'll introduce it in the next fortnight, so before Parliament rises on the 10th of December, but more likely that they will still proceed with it in the first half of next year. You also referenced the New South Wales Religious Discrimination Bill. So One Nation leader Mark Latham has introduced the Anti-Discrimination Amendment Religious Freedoms and Equalities Bill, which has been referred to a joint select committee in the New South Wales Parliament for inquiry, and they will be reporting in March of next year, which will then need to be considered by the state government.
Okay, so it's certainly not that they've disappeared. It's still definitely something we need to be keeping our focus on.
Absolutely, and I think the Commonwealth Government in particular, they have promised their stakeholders that they will deliver this, so we need to be on guard for them to introduce it.
Yeah, right, excellent. And so trying to get our heads around this a little bit, what is the worst case scenario if these bills are passed? What does that look like for people who are LGBTI?
It's kind of a nightmare, and under either of the 2 bills. So at the Commonwealth level, the Religious Discrimination Bill does 4 main terrible things. First, it would make it easier to make comments that offend, humiliate, intimidate, insult, or ridicule minorities, and it would do that by overriding state and territory vilification laws, including the Best Practice Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act. Second, it would make it easier for health practitioners like doctors, nurses, psychologists, and pharmacists to refuse to serve minorities. Now, technically, the legislation says that they can't refuse somebody because of who they are, but they can refuse to provide a particular service. So it's not that a pharmacist would be, say, refusing to dispense puberty blockers, refusing to serve a trans young person, but they'd be refusing to dispense puberty blockers, which has the same impact. So from the person on the other end, I don't think that technicality makes a difference. Third, it would make it easier for religious bodies to discriminate against others, which is really disappointing. It would allow religious organisations involved in service delivery to discriminate against other people of faith. So, for example, empowering religious schools to expel a student in the middle of year 12 for becoming an atheist. And fourth, it would make it more difficult for big business to promote diversity and inclusion. So these are the clauses around a certain ex-footballer, but it would really make it difficult for big business to introduce a code of conduct that promotes a harmonious workplace and promotes the reputation as a safe and inclusive space. Turning to the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act, and it has some similarities and some differences. So, for example, it doesn't just protect religious belief, it protects religious activities, even where those are unlawful activities, as long as they don't result in imprisonment. Like its Commonwealth counterpart, it inserts protected activity clauses based on a certain ex-footballer. It also allows religious ethos organisations to make discrimination claims against the state about the administration of state programs. So, for example, a religious service organisation could object to a grant program which says you must provide these services and you must administer this grant in a non-discriminatory way. So they'll be able to say that's actually discriminating against them. And again, like its Commonwealth counterpart, it would allow religious organisations to discriminate on the basis of belief. So preferencing and prioritising bigger faith groups against smaller faith groups.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, it's not just the LGBTI community that's going to potentially be impacted by this. It's actually people of different religious beliefs as well.
And that's the terrible thing. So undeniably, there is a gap. Religious belief needs to be protected under Commonwealth anti-discrimination law, and in New South Wales and in South Australia. All of those places don't have comprehensive religious anti-discrimination laws at the moment. But it should be done on the same basis as everybody else. It should not undermine the anti-discrimination protections enjoyed by other groups, including LGBTI people. And it shouldn't allow larger faith organisations to discriminate against smaller ones. And so, one thing that makes that perhaps most apparent, neither the Commonwealth nor the New South Wales Bill would prohibit religious vilification, which is something that, for example, Muslim Australians in the last 20 years have experienced far too much of. So you can tell which agenda is driving this, and it's not protecting minority faiths, it's protecting and entrenching the rights of larger faiths.
Gosh, this just gets more depressing the more you explain this. You touched on something there about the impact that this might have on diversity and inclusion initiatives for organisations, and this is obviously the space that I play in. And what you were describing to me when we chatted really did quite concern me. What do you think are the are going to be the biggest challenges for organisations if these bills do pass? What's a scenario it might create for a HR manager or the leaders of an organisation?
Well, there's lots of different possible scenarios. One which might come up pretty regularly is where somebody says to a co-worker something discriminatory about their sexual orientation or their gender identity where it is motivated by faith. So you're sinful, you're going to hell. So they say it in the lunchroom. Normally, a workplace code of conduct would say you need to treat all other employees with respect and not discriminate on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
If the Commonwealth Religious Discrimination Bill is passed and the HR manager tries to discipline the person for saying those things to their co-worker, then the HR manager could be found to have engaged in unlawful discrimination because that person will say, oh, this was motivated by my religious belief, and that's discrimination to mistreat me in that way. And even if ultimately, how that is determined depends on a range of different factors, and you'd have to go to the Human Rights Commission, potentially would end up in court. But really what it culturally will change is make it very, very difficult for people to even consider imposing codes of conduct like that. And so you would be leaving LGBTI co-workers and other co-workers to the mercy of kind of those expressions of harm from their co-workers.
Yeah, wow. And so I'm assuming that to be able to hold to that position that I made those comments because of my religious beliefs, that would be pretty hard to argue, wouldn't it, from an organisation's perspective?
Absolutely. And you can think of a lot of different things like a gender is binary, and therefore I don't need to accept your non-binary identity, or I don't need to accept your pronouns because that conflicts with my religious belief. So it's all sorts of different scenarios where trying to create an accepting and welcoming workplace, which is for the benefit of everyone, will be undermined by these bills.
Yeah. Yes, wow. All right. So advocacy-wise, obviously, as as people who are interested in inclusion, which is everybody who'll be watching this live or on the replay, what should we be doing? How do we help stop these bills getting passed?
Absolutely. In terms of the Commonwealth Bill, it's kind of on a holding pattern until the Commonwealth Government does reintroduce it. I would expect after it's reintroduced that it would go to a parliamentary committee, probably a Senate committee, and we really need everyone to be writing into that process to demonstrate the problems that it would create, but also to be advocating directly to government and the Labor Party, who haven't formally announced that they'd oppose it either, to say, yes, you should be protecting religious people against discrimination, but this is not the way to do it. You should be doing it on the same basis as everyone else. Similarly, at New South Wales, the committee has finished its hearings and has finished accepting submissions, but there is absolutely no reason why organisations, and particularly business, shouldn't be making the case to the state government to say, this bill will create a nightmare for everyone. This bill will undermine the rights of lots of different groups. This is not the way to protect people of faith. So I think big business did do a bit of that at the Commonwealth level during the exposure draft process of the religious discrimination bills. I don't think that they've done it as much at the New South Wales level, and I think that they need to step up, basically.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And hopefully there's plenty of employees or leaders who do watch this and can try and get their businesses to put a submission in. Wow, thank you so much for really kind of summing up what is such a really problematic series of events that's occurring in our country that perhaps has the potential to go through without the usual kind of uproar that it would have got pre-COVID perhaps and pre the events of this year. So I think this is a real call out to all listeners to kind of really be watching this space and doing exactly as what you've said there, to be writing to, advocating to your government and to that Senate committee.
Yeah.
So let's just move on a little bit. We're still going to talk about anti-discrimination laws, but one thing when you and I first spoke that it hadn't occurred to me, I know it makes sense, but it hadn't occurred to me that there was such discrepancy between states when it comes to anti-discrimination laws around being LGBTIQA+. And so what I was really kind of fascinated in when I thought about it afterwards is, say I am trans, what's the best state to live in Australia when it comes to these types of rights?
So we'll stick to anti-discrimination law because there's obviously lots of other legal issues as well. In terms of kind of binary trans people, they're covered in most states and territories except for the Northern Territory, which uses the terminology of transsexuality and fits it within sexuality, which is obviously quite outdated, and Western Australia, which is even worse. So it only allows people to make complaints if they've had their gender recognised by the government. So I think those are quite outdated approaches. On the other hand, non-binary people are in a worse position. So, for example, under the state and territory laws of New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia and the Northern Territory, none of their definitions actually include non-binary people. Which is obviously quite awful. We should note that in most situations, people will still be able to make complaints under the Sex Discrimination Act at the Commonwealth level because it covers the whole country, but not all situations. So not in terms of employees of some state and territory agencies, but also not having the choice that everyone else does to go to either their state body or their Commonwealth body comes with consequences. So it can come with different timelines that you have to make the complaint in. It can come with consequences in terms of costs, so the costs of filing, the costs of your legal representation, and in terms of possible damages as well. So it's not just as simple as saying, oh, well, you still have the Commonwealth Sex Discrimination Act. Actually, there might have been reasons why you should have gone to the state or territory body, but it's not open to you because the state and territory law is so outdated.
So just touching on that West Australian point, we've seen in the news, and, you know, I certainly picked up on this through some of your tweets around what they called a gaffe from the mayor, I think it was, which, you know, was to me anything but a gaffe. It was pretty rotten what he said on radio. Are you confident that kind of the publicity that's received is going to stem some positive change in this space? Is just as a personal opinion?
I don't know that gaffe in particular will lead to positive change. I think the WA government has made some positive noises in this area, but it's not moving quickly enough. So a couple of years ago, they referred their Equal Opportunity Act, which alongside New South Wales's law is probably the worst in the country, to their Law Reform Commission for review, but it's been sitting there for that period. They haven't released a discussion paper, and they're probably not going to before their state election in March. So maybe if the state government is re-elected and the Law Reform Commission makes a positive report, then they might take action in the next term of Parliament, but that's not quickly enough for trans people who aren't covered, for intersex people who aren't covered, for LGBT students in schools and teachers in schools who can be discriminated against in WA. Like, that timetable is not acceptable.
Yeah. This is getting more and more depressing. What if, and you mentioned intersex, what if I was intersex? Which state's really leading the way in inclusion and anti-discrimination laws for intersex people?
So again, sticking to anti-discrimination law to start, really the ACT, which is the only one that's fully adopted the terminology preferred by Intersex Human Rights Australia and the Darlington Statement. So they protect against discrimination on the basis of sex characteristics. Tasmania comes very close. They protect against discrimination on the basis of intersex variations of sex characteristics. And it's also protected, intersex status is protected in South Australia and under the Commonwealth Sex Discrimination Act, but not in any of the other states and territories. So again, there's a lot of modernisation to be done in that area. But obviously, more importantly, there needs to be an end to involuntary surgeries on intersex kids. And that's something that is being talked about at various levels. The Australian Human Rights Commission has a project on it. I know it's something being considered in Tasmania, but really nobody's moved on it yet. And in my view, that's probably the greatest human rights abuse against the LGBTI community in Australia currently. And the fact that, 7 years ago we had a bipartisan Senate inquiry recommend a way to end those surgeries, and none of it's happened. So I think we're really starting to fall behind the eight ball to the detriment of the human rights of intersex kids being born today.
I remember seeing that on one of your tweets, and to be honest, I was shocked that was still not something that had progressed. So, I think that's another thing that as listeners we can really start trying to advocate for if we're not already, because that just seems, so incredibly behind the times and outdated and so harmful for that not to change. Let's just shift a little bit. If we spoke a little bit about workplaces and what they can do, with all these kind of inconsistencies and, potential for religious discrimination bills and whatever else is going on, so many of the organisations, certainly that are listening and that I work with, are really, really keen on sitting well above the law and creating, being very proactive and creating those inclusive environments. Do you have some opinion on what they can do to just kind of make sure that they do continue to sail above that and really wrap themselves around their LGBTIQA plus staff, so that they don't have to interact with these laws that may not be sufficient or may require, these ridiculous amounts of money and time to prosecute?
Absolutely, and I think your last point is actually really important. So as much as I find anti-discrimination law interesting and passionate about making it the best that it can be for our communities, it's a really limited form of law. So just like sexual harassment, the onus is on the person who experiences discrimination to make complaints to address it. Often there's power imbalances in that process, so it could be about a boss or a company that's discriminated against you, and so the victim of discrimination has fewer resources. Making a complaint can take lots of time and resources and mental and emotional energy. So for those reasons, lots of people will never ever make a complaint, even if they've been discriminated against. They'll make what for them is a perfectly rational decision to go elsewhere. And if that's a well-qualified employee or member of your team, you will lose them, because they, rather than go through a discrimination complaint or a grievance process, for them, in some cases, it will be a rational and easier decision to leave and take their own talent somewhere else. So I guess flipping that over, though, one of the best things about anti-discrimination law is that it's really useful in kind of a normative value, in standard setting. So it can provide a clear guide of what type of behaviour is or is not to be accepted. And what organisations need to do is to use that in a proactive way. So through regular training, I work at a great organisation. I've only been there just over 3 years. We've already had our second refresher training for everyone about anti-discrimination and harassment policies and bullying policies. And so even though it's probably the most inclusive and progressive workplace that I've ever worked in, it's showing the way that actually you need to entrench that culture and prevent discrimination from happening, because it's far, far easier to do that than to react and try and repair damage, which in some cases it's not repairable. So I think really standard setting from the top. So having CEOs and managers really demonstrating by example, and whether that's making the use of pronouns commonplace, whether it's making sure that your policies are up to date and you've considered things like transition leave, making sure that you have ways to ensure that your workplace is educated, but you also have ways that people can learn. So not everyone knows everything about our communities. I don't think anyone knows everything about our communities. So you need to have a way that your staff members can learn in an inclusive and an invited way in, as long as it's not, people aren't being malicious, then we all have ways and things that we can learn.
Yeah, that's a really great way to end, I think, is just some really brilliant tips there for organisations to try to, as you say, prevention, try to prevent having their staff or their customers, clients, students have to consider going down a route of using or relying upon those anti-discrimination laws. I want to thank you so much, Alastair. Some of this has been quite a heavy topic, but such a valuable one. And I think we'll see this video shared around a bit in terms of the education that you've provided to a whole bunch of us to, number one, know what we should be advocating for and what we should be paying more attention to. And definitely those religious discrimination bills as a start, but also those failings of various state governments to really act in this space. And also what we can do in the workplace. So thank you so much for that. Just before we go, I did mention my shirt earlier today. I did pay for this shirt, so I'm not giving a plug for someone, but there's a business called Charlie Boy, which is a Sydney-based business, and they are making gender-neutral shirts for anybody who wants to log on and order a shirt that actually is tailored to your shape. And for those of you who do sit in that gender diverse, non-binary space that I spend a bit of time sitting in, shopping for clothes is one of the most difficult things you can do. So I just wanted to make a plug out for that. There are some great businesses starting up in this space, and it'll be great to see a lot more that are providing more accessible clothing to the LGBTIQA plus community. So just a little shout out there. Thanks for tuning in again. This will get loaded up onto my YouTube channel as usual, which will then have the captions associated with it. So feel free to share from there. And I will see you again next week and the week after, and we'll do a few more before Christmas. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining me, Alastair, and have a good weekend, everybody.
Thanks very much.